A $500 fine for planting roses. The HOA president's smirk said it all. Another victory. But William Grant wasn't just another homeowner. Retired Supreme Court judges don't lose. Not to petty tyrants wielding rulebooks like weapons. Especially when the violation was a tribute to his late wife. He folded the citation neatly, eyes glinting. This wouldn't end with a fine. It would end with a reckoning. William stood on his front lawn, gazing at the vibrant roses his wife had planted with him years ago. The blossoms were in full bloom, each petal a memory of the woman he loved and lost. His grip on the fine tightened, the ridiculous charge stinging more than he cared to admit. Not because of the money, but because someone had dared to label his wife's cherished flower bed an unapproved project. Across the street, the polo-shirted dictator himself was swaggering toward a golf cart. Richard Langley, HOA president, wore authority like a crown. He barked orders at neighbors, scribbling violations on a clipboard. When he spotted William, that smug grin only widened. William walked to the curb, the violation notice crumpling in his fist. "Explain, now." Richard glanced up, feigning surprise. "What's there to explain, Grant? Those roses don't meet community standards. Pay up or shut up. My rules don't bend for sentimental fools." "Sentimental fools," William repeated, voice steady. "You're serious? You think I need your permission to plant roses on my own property?" Richard shrugged, tapping his clipboard. "All exterior modifications require approval. Didn't you read the bylaws?" William's jaw tightened. "I did, Langley. Nowhere does it say anything about a flower bed needing to be pre-approved." "Well," Richard drawled, "maybe you're not as sharp as you think. You can pay the fine, or appeal. You'll lose either way." William studied the man, noting the cheap bravado that always precedes a bully's power trip. "Is that so?" Richard smirked. "Trust me. This is my neighborhood, Grant. I always win." William folded the fine with meticulous calm. He thought of his wife's smile, how she loved tending those roses, how she refused to back down from anyone. "We'll see." That evening, William retreated to his home office. He spread out the HOA bylaws, scanning each line, page after page of restrictions and rules. In many neighborhoods, HOAs are meant to preserve property values and maintain shared spaces. But this one read more like a tyrant's manifesto. While flipping through, he noticed something interesting in the financial appendix. Page 62 listed landscaping costs that reached $82,000 last year. Yet the community pool hadn't opened once, and the roads were dotted with potholes. Where exactly was the money going? He added a note to his legal pad, then turned to the sections on violations. They were structured in a way that allowed for broad interpretation. That gave the president, Langley, way too much power. The same pattern emerged. Broad rules he could twist to fine at will. Minimal oversight from the rest of the board. It felt less like a homeowners association and more like a personal kingdom. The next morning, William stepped outside to find Richard already zipping around in his golf cart. He watched him dole out more citations. A neighbor's American flag was too large. Another's garden gnome was unapproved decor. Meanwhile, Richard's own property had violations galore, hedges easily a foot taller than allowed, an oil-stained driveway. None of that stopped him from slapping fines on others. William flagged him down with a raised hand. "Morning. Quick question." Richard slowed his cart, glaring. "Got somewhere to be, Grant. Make it fast." William held out his phone. "You wrote me up for unapproved flower beds. But if we're enforcing rules, how about your hedges? Section 3, subsection 5. They're too tall by at least 12 inches. Then there's your cracked driveway, plus an unauthorized deck extension. Seems you're not following your own rules." "Are you threatening me?" Richard snapped. William gave a casual shrug. "Just an observation." Richard's face darkened. "Do yourself a favor, stop digging for trouble." William took a sip from his coffee. "I don't have to dig for what's lying on the surface." By noon, Richard found a fresh violation on his own doorstep. William watched from his office window, a hint of satisfaction in his eyes as Langley tore open the envelope and read the fine. Seeing the HOA president sputter in rage felt like the first small victory. But William knew bullies rarely back down. This was just the opening salvo. A few hours later, William attended the monthly HOA meeting at the community clubhouse. Residents milled about, many looking bored or anxious. At the front table sat the board, 3 middle-aged men who seemed content to let Richard run the show. Once the meeting started, Richard pounded a gavel more like a feudal lord demanding silence than a person facilitating a discussion. He rattled off agenda items until at last he announced, "Next, a violation dispute. Mr. Grant wants to contest his fine." William stood, exuding a calm authority. "Indeed. I'd like to address the grounds for this violation." Richard cut him off. "Let's be clear. This isn't a court of law, Judge. It's an HOA hearing and I run it. You violated the rules, plain and simple." "Which rules would those be?" William asked. "Because the guidelines mention major structural changes, not flower beds." "Agree to disagree," Richard shot back with a smug half-smile. "But the fine stands." A murmur rose in the audience. One older woman spoke up, arms crossed over her chest. "I've lived here a decade. Never asked permission to plant anything." Richard slammed his gavel. "That's enough." He turned to William. "You can pay, or you can rack up interest. Let me guess which way you'll go." William smiled coolly. "You're awfully confident, Langley." "Because I know exactly how this ends." Richard glowered. "And it won't be in your favor." William said nothing more, letting silence speak volumes. That evening, William decided to investigate further. He took a discreet stroll around the neighborhood, knocking on doors, chatting with neighbors. A pattern emerged. Newcomers bore the brunt of steep fines, while Richard and his cronies skated by despite obvious violations. Tales of intimidation abounded. One family had been fined $1,200 for painting their garage door off-white instead of pure white. Another single mother paid $500 for a non-compliant security camera. Yet the same model was visible on a board member's house without penalty. As he gathered these stories, William also recalled that suspicious's $82,000 landscaping figure. He asked a few people about community improvements, and they laughed bitterly. "Improvements? We can barely get them to fix broken streetlights," one neighbor scoffed. That night, William dug deeper into the association's financial records, cross-referencing budgets, expenditures, and the actual condition of the neighborhood. The more he read, the more something stank of corruption. Tens of thousands of dollars in fees were nowhere to be found in the community's official maintenance budget. Where had all that money gone? William sat back in his leather chair, exhaling. "Langley," he said quietly, "you've got yourself a nice little racket. Bullies always slip up eventually. Fraud is never invisible if you know where to look." The next morning, William woke to a stack of new violations taped to his door. His mailbox was the wrong color. His fence was half an inch too tall. His bird feeder wasn't approved, and so on. 6 separate fines in total. He couldn't help but laugh at the sheer pettiness. This was Richard's attempt at intimidation. "Desperate moves, Langley," William muttered, flipping through them. He was accustomed to dealing with people who thought power meant bending laws to suit their whims. As a Supreme Court judge, he'd presided over cases with far higher stakes. This petty tyrant would regret drawing so much attention to himself. He returned to his desk and pored over more documents. Some older financial reports revealed the pool used to be open and well-maintained. Then Richard took over the HOA presidency a few years back, and suddenly the pool was under repair every summer. Expenditures soared, but nobody saw where the money went. A single line item, MISC, landscaping and maintenance, ballooned to tens of thousands of dollars annually. Yet all anyone noticed were half-dead shrubs near the entrance sign. A grin formed on William's face when he found exactly what he needed. A series of checks from the HOA account written out to an LLC that didn't appear in any public records. He suspected it was a shell company Langley used to funnel money. He printed out the check images, highlighting the suspicious pattern. This was no longer about petty fines. It was about exposing a financial predator. William compiled everything into a neat binder, each revelation building a case for criminal fraud. He also reached out to an old contact, Dan Matthews, an investigative journalist who thrived on stories of local corruption. Dan confirmed William's suspicion. Langley had a history of questionable behavior with a previous HOA. He'd barely escaped charges by paying a settlement. Now the pattern was repeating. Armed with evidence, William decided to request an official breakdown of HOA finances. He emailed the board, citing legal precedent that compelled them to share financial documents upon request. Hours later, Richard responded with a curt message refusing to comply and fining William an additional $1,000 for a cracked driveway. That same night, motion sensors caught Richard creeping onto William's property, spraying a thin line of black paint to simulate fresh cracks. William's security cameras captured every... Richard's face twisted with malicious glee as he defaced the driveway. When William saw the footage, he nearly shook his head in disbelief. "Amateur hour," he murmured, transferring the recording to a flash drive. That was the final piece of proof he needed. The next HOA meeting was packed. News had circulated that William had found dirt on Langley, literal and figurative. Homeowners who'd been steamrolled by arbitrary fines crowded the clubhouse, hungry for answers. Richard sat at the front with his usual entourage of spineless board members. Richard tried to call the meeting to order, but chatter filled the space, an undercurrent of anger and excitement. When he finally banged the gavel, his face was flushed with irritation. "We're here to address a few housekeeping items," he began. "First," William rose, "Mr. Langley, you've been charging me for a cracked driveway. Would you care to explain this?" He held up a photo showing Richard in the act of vandalizing the property. Gasps fluttered across the room. Richard's face turned ashen. That's not real. It's doctored." William slid a USB drive onto the table. "Here's the security footage if anyone wants to see the real version. You vandalized my driveway, then slapped me with a $1,000 fine. That's fraud." The crowd murmured in shock. A few neighbors shouted their own grievances. "He did the same thing to me last year," one yelled. "He claimed my lawn was half an inch too tall," another added. Richard hammered his gavel, voice trembling. "Order. I will not tolerate these baseless allegations." William stepped forward. "This isn't baseless." He held up the binder of financial records. "There's also the matter of tens of thousands of dollars in HOA funds unaccounted for. Care to explain why the pool was never reopened? Or why that $82,000 landscaping budget never touched a single wilted shrub?" Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Richard swallowed hard, eyes darting between furious homeowners and the stack of papers in William's hand. One of the board members asked in a weak voice, "Richard, did you spend the money?" Richard bolted from his seat, pushing past startled neighbors. The meeting erupted into pandemonium. Some chased after him. Others surrounded the table to look at William's evidence. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood buzzed with talk of Richard's exposed fraud. William filed formal complaints with local authorities, outlining the embezzlement. The state attorney's office opened an investigation. Richard, cornered and desperate, took one last desperate swing. He mailed William a certified letter threatening foreclosure on William's home over unpaid fines. It was a blatant abuse of HOA foreclosure powers, one that would only strengthen the criminal case against him. William's response was to file 2 lawsuits: civil suit against Richard personally for fraud, defamation, and damages, and another against the HOA for violating homeowners' rights and financial mismanagement. Then he made a single "State Attorney's Office," a voice answered. William's expression was steely. "I have a significant HOA corruption case. I think you'll find it interesting." That evening, William waited on his porch, sipping bourbon. Like clockwork, Richard's car screeched into the driveway. The man stormed up the walkway, brandishing legal paperwork. Sweat beaded on his forehead, fear in his eyes. "You think you're smart, Judge?" he spat. "You come into my neighborhood and tear it apart?" William took another slow sip. "This was never your neighborhood, Langley. You just pretended it was. And now that pretense is falling apart." Richard shook the foreclosure notice at William. "I can still take your house. You think a lawsuit scares me? I'll bury you with legal fees." William chuckled, setting his glass down. "Do your worst. Actually, let me correct that, you already have, and it's about to backfire. Between the vandalism, the financial records, and your board's open revolt, you're finished." Richard's hand shook, the notice fluttering. "I have the board," he snarled. "I have the bylaws." William shrugged, unruffled. "You had them. Now you have no allies left. Not once they see your bank statements, your shell company, your personal expenses paid for with HOA money." The next day, Richard sent a resignation letter to every homeowner. He claimed it was for personal reasons, but nobody believed him. An emergency HOA meeting was called that evening. The turnout was unprecedented. Homeowners lined the walls, many of them victims of Richard's extortion. Linda Carter, the interim president, nervously took the podium to officially acknowledge his resignation and discuss next steps. Then, midway through the agenda, 2 uniformed police officers entered. They walked straight to Richard, who had slumped in a back corner, hoping to slink out unnoticed. "Richard Langley?" one officer asked. His eyes flickered with panic. "Yes, you're under arrest for fraud, financial mismanagement, and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." The hush that followed was broken by a few stunned gasps and the creaking of chairs as people stood to watch. The click of handcuffs was the final gavel on Richard's reign of intimidation. Neighbors openly cheered or whispered in disbelief. As they led him away, Richard's furious glare flicked toward William. William raised an eyebrow and offered a faint, triumphant nod. With Richard gone, the HOA board scattered like rats on a sinking ship. Some members had clearly been complicit, while others had simply been too cowardly to stand up to him. Either way, the entire board resigned within days. When William presented his findings to the remaining community leaders, it was obvious the association couldn't survive without a complete overhaul. In a landslide vote, the homeowners dissolved the HOA altogether, effectively stripping it of the power Richard had once wielded like a sword. But the victory felt incomplete without restitution. William spearheaded a committee to review every dubious fine issued in the past 5 years. They discovered hundreds of thousands of dollars unfairly extracted from homeowners. Some had been slapped with relentless fees, forced to empty their savings or take out loans. Others lived in constant fear of foreclosure. Now, with the HOA dismantled, refunds began pouring back. The elderly couple who had lost $1,200 over their off-white garage door wept tears of joy when they received a check. The single mother got her $500 back for the security camera violation. The military veteran who nearly lost his home after a single fallen branch triggered an onslaught of fines was finally refunded the full amount. One by one, neighbors lined up to reclaim what Richard had stolen. The funds came from seized assets. Richard's home, car, and bank accounts were liquidated under the restitution agreement. Justice felt checks were placed in the very hands from which he'd stolen. William didn't bother attending Richard's sentencing hearing. He already knew the outcome, a 3-year prison term as part of the plea deal. The journalist Dan Matthews sent him a quick text confirming the sentence. William felt a calm sense of closure. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood underwent a transformation. Without the oppressive rules and arbitrary fines, homeowners began to breathe freely. Gardens sprouted, kids played in the streets, and people replaced constant vigilance with genuine community spirit. A simple neighborhood council formed to handle practical concerns, road maintenance, security, trash collection, without strangling everyone with overreaching bylaws. William sat on his porch gazing at the roses. They were as beautiful as ever, a living testament to his wife's love for color and life. Each petal reminded him why he'd fought, not out of vanity, but to defend the memory of someone who believed in flourishing, not controlling. He sipped his bourbon and allowed himself a small smile. Maybe retirement wouldn't be so dull after all. One afternoon, his neighbor Tom ambled over, grinning from ear to ear. "Judge, you've got a phone call from some folks across town. Another HOA. They heard you took down Langley and want your help exposing their own corrupt board." William set aside his pruning shears, regarding Tom with amusement. "Word travels fast." Tom chuckled. "So, you interested in playing hero again?" William thought of the hours he spent unraveling Richard's corruption, the nights combing through financial records, the tension of public showdowns. Then he remembered the satisfaction of seeing justice served, the relief on people's faces when tyranny fell apart. He rose, brushing dirt from his hands. "Tell them," he said at last. "I'll take a look at their case." Because if there was one thing he'd learned, it was this. Small-time tyrants flourish only when no one dares to fight back. And William Grant had decided there was nothing he loved more than a good fight in the name of justice. So ended Richard Langley's petty empire. It began with a $500 fine for roses, and collapsed under the weight of crimes far graver. The roses remained, bright and unyielding, a quiet testament that true strength often blooms from the most personal of causes. What about you? Ever faced an HOA nightmare? Share your wildest experiences. And remember, sometimes all it takes is one determined person to bring the whole corrupt tower tumbling down. Like and subscribe for more wild tales of justice.